Okay, so I guess we're, yeah, it's exactly 101. So let's make a start. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sam Berens, who's going to be talking to us about his work in his previous postdoc in York about memory and forgetting. So over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you all for coming and those joining online. Today I'm going to be talking about, as Chris mentioned, some work that I was principally doing while I was a postdoc at the University of York with Aidan Horner. And this was run in collaboration with Blake Richards, who's an assistant professor at McGill University now in Canada. And this work involves a large-scale behavioral study that we ran online over the web in healthy participants, intended to inform some theoretical models of healthy memory function. I'll talk a bit more about this, but it was really it was really inspired by a lot of Blake's work that he had done in rodents. And it formed the basis of a registered report. It was the first registered report that I was involved with, which has now been published in Nature Human Behavior. That was an experience. I would be happy to share my thoughts and experiences with you as well if you have any questions about that. But for those who aren't familiar, registered report, basically we had you write up a introduction and analysis plan. You send it off to be peer reviewed. We had the benefit of 5 exceptional reviewers who all gave these highly detailed, well thought out feedback on the project. It went through a couple of rounds of peer review at that stage. We also had the journal editor, who was amazing at the time, who was giving us feedback. It was really, really good. It took a while, but it was good. I can talk about that a bit more in the questions as well. Okay, so to get into the meat of the presentation, I'm going to be making a distinction between 2 forms of forgetting. We have accessibility, which is a threshold process by which a particular item may be either recalled or not. So as an example, imagine you're trying to maintain a mental shopping list of 4 items: coffee, milk, cheese, and bread. By the time you actually get to the shop and you're retrieving these items from memory, a loss of accessibility would entail that one or more of these items is no longer accessible to you at the point of recall. You just simply can't get it from memory. In contrast to this, we make there are losses in memory precision. So a loss in memory precision is while a memory remains accessible, its fidelity might decrease with time. So if you imagine that if you drove to the shops, you may very well remember that you parked your car somewhere in the car park. You know that you parked your car there today, but your ability to localize that car in the space, in that car park space, might gradually decrease with time, such that you're less and less able to localize it. You do get losses in memory accessibility for, for instance, driving your car to the car park and parking in the car park. A day I have a funny story about that, where my brother thought that his bike got stolen when actually he had just left it in a completely different place that day. But yes, so you could have 2 different types of forgetting: losses in accessibility, this threshold process, or losses in precision, a kind of a decay or a loss of fidelity of memory traces. And one of the reasons that we're interested in these 2 different types of forgetting is that their relative contributions to overall levels of forgetting might tell us a bit about how information is being encoded in memory and how it's being supported. So, for instance, if your memories depend on very specific associations between a memory cue and a memory target, then anything that disrupts that cue-target relationship in memory can lead to a loss of memory accessibility. Whereas if your memories are more dependent on a group of associations that are all working together to build a specific association, then you might expect forgetting to principally involve losses in memory precision rather than accessibility. Okay, so how do we dissociate accessibility and precision in these behavioral tasks? Well, to do this, we ask participants to complete 2 phases of a memory task. During the study phase, participants were shown a series of concrete nouns, for instance, fox, and were asked to associate each one of these nouns with a position around a circle that was shown on the screen. So to be specific, we first showed the to be learned location over here. And then that disappeared. We showed the concrete noun in the center of the circle. And then we asked participants to reproduce the to be learned location that they had seen in a couple of slides back. And that went on there were something like 200 words that they were trying to learn the locations of. It was very boring. It went on for about 40 minutes. As I say, this was all run over online. There were some in-person pilot testings as well, but yeah. And kind of one thing I do want to stress is that during this study phase, we were asking participants to engage in a strategy to remember these things for a later date. So what we actually asked them to do was to try and visualize the object that the word referred to as being positioned just outside of the circle at that specific location. That was a core part of our instructions to try and have that mental imagery. One important, or I guess, interesting consideration is that not everyone would have been able to do that. There's a large proportion of the population who can't, well, relatively a large proportion of the population who can't do that, but that were our instructions. Sometime later, we asked participants to complete a test session. And during these test sessions, it's ran very similarly on each trial. Participants saw a starting location, and then a word appeared in the center of the circle, and they just simply had to reproduce that location that was associated with that word from the study phase. So they just dragged a cursor around the circle, reproduced the location, much like they had done in the initial study phase. And then immediately after that, they were asked, what do they remember? So they were asked a subjective judgment about whether they saw the word and the location together. They remember the word and the location together, whether they only remembered the word and they're making a guess, or whether it was a complete guess. They can't even remember seeing the word. Now, this subjective judgment data, it was something actually the reviewers asked us to put in. We didn't have specific a priori hypotheses about it. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but I can do if you want to know more about it in the questions. So is this all I want to say about this? Yes. One extra thing. The time we manipulated the time between the study and the test phases across participants. So this was a between subjects factor that we had. And the test phase could have taken place immediately after the study phase, what we call the 0-hour retention interval, or it could have happened 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, so 2 days, or 4 days after the study phase. So there were 7 different retention intervals in total, and we tested memory for a large number of participants across those 7 different intervals. Okay. So in terms of the analysis, we know, or for every test trial that a participant gives us or performs, we have 2 things. We know the target location that was associated with that word. That's the location that was shown at the study phase. And here I'm marking the target location with this red cross around the circle. And we know the response location. So this is the response that was given to the participant. That's the green, the red circle around the bigger circle. And like many before us, we used a probabilistic mixture model to infer 2 things from these data. Firstly, the proportion of responses that were not based on a random guess. So, you can imagine that you go through this task just randomly guessing your everything. You're just not paying attention at all. You're just, pressing loads of buttons just to get through to the end. So, we wanted to explicitly infer the proportion of responses that were not based on a random guess, or i.e. the proportion of memory-guided responses. And secondly, we wanted to know, well, when a response was likely to be memory-guided, what was the average precision or the average accuracy in terms of angular error of that response? So to illustrate how this mixture model works that we used, I'm on the right, I'm plotting this a histogram of the distribution of angular errors. So if a response is very accurate, then it will be placed in the histogram at the center around the 0 angular error point, if you like, which is at the center of this histogram. And then if you've got a very inaccurate response, it will be binned kind of at the extreme left or right tail ends of this distribution, of this histogram, sorry. Now, importantly, random guesses can be differentiated from memory-guided responses to a certain extent by the fact that random guesses should be uniformly distributed. They should have kind of no preferred angular error. By their very nature, they're just random. So what we do to these data is we fit 2 different components. The first is a uniform distribution, which kind of models the proportion of angular, of memory-guided, of random guesses, sorry. And I'm illustrating that uniform distribution with this, the height of this blue line. So you can see it kind of vary on every trial. It's going up and down and updating the number of guesses that are being made. The second component that we fit to the histogram is this von Mises distribution, which is just a bell-shaped curve that can be wrapped around a circle, and that varies only in its width. So if it's got if it's very broad, then the memory-guided responses are not very accurate, whereas if it's quite tight, then the memory-guided responses are highly accurate. So we fit these 2 components, and from these this mixture model, we get 2 numbers. We get P, which is the proportion of memory-guided responses. So this is the probability that a response, the proportion of word location associations that were based on a memory, according to the model, is P, as I say. And we have a measure called kappa. Kappa is the width of that von Mises distribution. Higher values of kappa indicate that the width is smaller, so it's like a concentration. The concentration is tighter, memory precision is higher. But in these the native forms, sorry, of accessibility of these, the probability and this kappa parameters, they're not directly comparable with one another. They are completely different metrics. They relate to different things. So what we did was use some information theory to convert them into a common metric, so that they could be more directly compared to one another. And the measures that we came up with are I subscript P for accessibility. So this is just, it's derived from the proportion of memory-guided responses, as I say. I subscript K, precision. It's the total amount of memory attributed to memory precision, total amount of information attributed to memory precision. And we can also combine these measures into a total information metric, IT. So to illustrate how these relate to each other, I've got this kind of rough analogy over here. There's a nice geometric intuition for how this all works. If you imagine that IT represent the total amount of information that you're maintaining in memory is some finite store memory system that has a finite size, then you may be able to decompose the size of that system into 2 different things. One thing that you might be able to pull out is IP, the total number of word location associations that you can restore, if you like, the number of slots, and IK, the total amount of information in this storage system that is dedicated to encoding the precision of a memory on average. So you can think of these two measures as like independent measures that describe what's going on in the system as a whole. And these measures have a nice property that IT, the total amount of information that's stored, is proportional to both IP and IK. That's kind of the intuition behind it. Okay, so to kind of summarize the study details, as I mentioned, we ran this as a registered report. The stage 1 protocol is published on the Sci archive. In total, we had 1,466 people who showed some sort of interest in the experiment. Of those, 810 gave informed consent to take part. 222, so a fairly significant proportion, were excluded from the final data set. Now, they could have been excluded at two phases, either while they were doing the study task itself, before they had even started the test, because they walked away from the computer, or they didn't meet our inclusion criteria for that study phase. They could have also been excluded for the test phase because they, again, did similar sorts of things. They weren't paid attention, their responses were far too quick, unreasonably quick, things like that. We also had 157 participants who didn't show up for their final test session. So I mentioned that we had those 7 different retention intervals. Participants were told about which retention interval they were allocated to before they took part. And if they missed that by an hour, then they couldn't take part anymore. So it's quite strict in that respect. And yeah, this left us with 431 usable data sets. 431, that gave us about 60 participants in each of our 7 different retention intervals, just over 60 on average. And actually that was intended. Our stopping rule, one of our stopping rules for this study, was that we had at least 60 usable data sets in each condition before we could stop collecting data. Okay, so here I am plotting the total information metric, IT. So this is the overall measure of memory performance, if you like, the composite measure, across these 7 different retention intervals. And it's not a very big surprise, as you may expect. There is a decline in memory performance over time, statistically significant. We actually used Bayes factors in this study. That was one of the required. Well, we had to kind of for the register report. The way it turned out, it was unfeasible to guarantee that we would collect enough data to use classical inference on these data. So we had a Bayesian stopping rule. And so I'm going to show all Bayes factors in this presentation, although I will present the classical statistics as well. There is a decline in memory performance with time, but it's actually fairly small relative. If you compare this to the relative to the amount of individual differences across participants, the individual differences across participants is huge, relative to the average levels of forgetting over time. That was one thing that was relatively surprising. But yeah, just to summarize, all of the things that I'll show you, the results depended on these generalized linear mixed effects models that assumed a logarithmic, or an exponential, I should say, an exponential forgetting curve with time. So that's not really because we expected forgetting to be exponentially shaped. It was just a convenient way of modeling the data that accounted for most of the variance that we were interested in. Dispersion modeled by the gamma distribution, and all the confidence intervals all of the error bars are 95% confidence intervals. Okay, so rather than that total information metric, the more interesting question is what underlies this loss in total information with time. So I'm not going to put this to a poll because there aren't that many of you here, and I kind of know what people's intuitions are. But I'm going to ask. So the audience here, would you say that it's principally driven by losses in memory accessibility? If you think it's that, then put your hands up now. Okay, so there's 4 of you. Is it principally driven by losses in memory precision? No. Or lower levels of both? Okay, so 2 of you. So you are the first audience that have got this broadly correct. It is driven by losses in memory accessibility. Most people actually say lower levels of both from the polls that I've done before. And it was something that surprised us initially. But yes, as I say, here are the results split by our information theory metric of accessibility over here and precision. And the idea is that you can kind of see this gradual decline in accessibility with time, and precision stays pretty constant. It's pretty much flat across those seven different retention intervals. There is somewhat of a small dip after the first 0 to 6 hours sort of thing, but really it's just a flat line. So the take-home message is if you remember a word location association after 96 hours, it's more or less just as precisely remembered as if you had remembered it maybe around 6 hours after the study. So it doesn't, the precision of these memories doesn't change very much with time. It's really losses in accessibility, the number of word location associations that you're remembering, that changes. Okay, so that's kind of the one of the broad take-home messages I want. I'll bring this slide up again. That's one of the take-home messages I wanted to cover for the first part of this talk. This was we expected this pattern by the time that we started running the registered report, because we had done a lot of pilot testing to show that this would actually show up. So it was just kind of confirmatory by the time that the registered report was run. But we had some other hypotheses that we also pre-registered as part of the report that I will go on to now. So another focus of this project was whether forgetting was modulated by a generalizable pattern in the memories that you're learning. And this, as I say, this is the part that was directly inspired by the work of our collaborator Blake Richards. These are figures from his Nature Neuroscience paper that he published in 2014. And Blake's idea here was that if rodents, actually I think they were mice, they weren't rats, if mice learn a bunch of locations across a series of trials, and those locations conform to some spatial pattern, that the process of memory consolidation will make that pattern more strongly represented in the mice behavior. So that was the idea, and indeed he found some very good evidence for this. So what he did, to summarize, is he showed on various days he trained these hidden escape platforms in a Morris water maze, and then tested those mice at 2 different retention intervals. Tested them 1 day after the study, after the learning phase, or 30 days after the learning phase, and just looked at their swimming behavior around that water maze at these 2 different retention intervals, and found that 1 day after the study phase, the swimming behavior was heavily influenced, say, by the last platform that they learned the location of. Yeah, so it was very heavily, it was heavily influenced by sort of like recency effects. Whereas after 30 days, it's kind of obvious. It's more their swim behavior was more representative of the spatial pattern over the previous days as a whole. Like kind of they more faithfully represented that pattern. And this was shown using a measure called the KL divergence, this DKL statistic. Lower levels of DKL show a closer correspondence between the swimming behavior and the underlying spatial distribution, and so it actually decreased, showing a closer correspondence after 30 days. And this idea, this kind of supports this idea of consolidation acting to kind of mix your memories together and pull out generalizable patterns. It's a very sexy idea in neuroscience at the moment. Okay, so how did we do something similar? Well, we couldn't put humans in a swimming pool and make them swim for their lives. So nor would we want to. I wouldn't want to do that with mice, to be honest. But we kind of showed participants, we had these word location associations, and we clustered some of them. So previously, I've been hiding some of the data from you. I only showed you the data from the non-clustered condition. The non-clustered condition, all of the words belong to a broad semantic category. So they were, for instance, all human-made objects, things like stapler, bottle, I was going to say mouse, but no, chalk, I guess, maybe. and we associated those with non-clustered locations around the circle. They were all uniformly distributed. In a separate condition that I've not shown you the data for, the clustered condition, they were all again human-made, they were all semantically related words. So they were all, for instance, concrete nouns that referred to natural things like frog, tree. You know, they were semantically related in that respect. But they were all associated with locations around a specific clustered location. In this case, around the 2 o'clock position of this circle. And the idea here was that participants could pull out a generalizable pattern for these clustered locations. It's like a shortcut, and at tests they could rely on that pattern to localize those words. That's the idea. The question is whether they would be better able to do that after longer delays, like the mice were able to do. Is this kind of behavior, is forgetting modulated by this pattern? Is there the strength of the patterns that we see in human behavior, do they increase with time, just as the mice we see in the mice data? Okay, so first, again, just the boring total information metric, the kind of average level of performance, if you like, not decomposed by accessibility or precision. And this was interesting. So one thing that we wanted to look at first was whether there's an overall boost in the level of total information for the clustered condition. Because you might expect that if you've got a generalizable pattern, then you'll be able to remember more word location associations, perhaps even more accurately. So such that the total amount of information in memory kind of gets boosted, if you like. But we didn't see that. In fact, we found more evidence in favor of the null hypothesis for this effect. So there was no main effect of clustering, no overall increase in performance for the clustered condition. So yeah, that was a bit of a surprise. Again, it wasn't too much of a surprise. No, that was definitely a surprise. My pilot data showed this, but it only had like 20 people per retention interval. So it was nice to be surprised in that respect. We also wanted to test this other subtly related idea. It's different, but it is related. The idea would have been that there would have been an interaction between clustering and time, right? So if the effect of these patterns is really only expressed at longer and longer attention intervals, rather than a main effect of clustering on this total information metric, you might see higher levels of total information at the later retention intervals alone. So that was an a priori hypothesis that would show higher levels of specifically clustered information at these later retention intervals relative to shorter retention intervals where they might be approximately equal. In fact, we found evidence against that, evidence in the opposite direction. If anything, it's the case that clustering increases the amount of total information in early retention intervals only very slightly. The base factors weren't deemed sensitive enough to be a discovery according to the criteria that Nature Human Behavior set out. They asked for base factors over 10. It's statistically significant, and that's just showing us this unexpected finding that the cluster really only has an advantage early on. Yeah, so that's not predicted, and it goes against some of the work, the theoretical work that I showed earlier, or I hinted to earlier. Okay. So again, above and beyond looking at the total information metric, the specific information metrics, these accessibility and precision scores, are more revealing. They can tell us more about what's going on. And one a priori prediction that we had was that the clustered condition would boost the overall levels of memory accessibility, but lower the levels of memory precision. Again, this was derived from pilot data, but it does make intuitive sense. The idea is that if you have a higher level, if you have a pattern, you should remember that more of the word location words belong to that pattern, and you can kind of like use it as a shortcut, as I say, you remember, you just group them all into the same lot. But as a consequence of that, they kind of bleed together. So you got lots of interference within the word location associations in that pattern. You can't precisely localize words. So you get this increase in memory accessibility in the clustered condition and decreases in memory precision. Yes?
Can I just check that you're talking about accessibility of the name location association?
Yes.
Not just whether or not they remember having seen the name.
Not whether they haven't. No. It's just it's precisely the location. It's really we're just testing the location memory because the word is just the cue.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't make that clear. Yeah, we see this. We meet our prediction basically on this, that clustering yields higher levels of accessibility but lower levels of precision across the board, like averaged across retention intervals. So that was quite relative. Well, not strong effect, but it was unambiguously there. And this happens. It's kind of interesting to note that this happens even though, if I go back to the previous slide, there was no overall benefit for the clustered condition, right? Like there was no overall boost in the level of memory performance for the clustered condition. So there was a balanced trade-off. It's not that what we can say about this is that it's not really that clustering increases the amount of information that you store in memory. It's more that it changes the quality of the information that you're storing. So you encode approximate locations at the expense of specific locations, if you like. A final and again related hypothesis was that clustering would alter the rate of change in either accessibility or precision. We didn't have a clear idea of exactly what this would mean going into this study, but it was a registered prediction. And it derived again from the behavioral, the rodent work that Blake had done and the theoretical models. The idea was that if systems consolidation is doing something to these memories, then it's going to kind of like change alter the rate of change of loss in either accessibility or precision or both. You know, it might slow it down or something like that. But we found no evidence for that. Basically, clustering, it doesn't have an overall boost. All it does is it shifts the balance of accessibility and precision. It increases accessibility, reduces precision, but that happens right from the get-go, right from just after the study phase, no consolidation involved. And then that thing that is locked in early on persists through time. And then the only things that you see change in time are reduced levels of accessibility across the board. So that's the pattern that we're seeing. There was, again, like if you squint, you can kind of see that precision sort of declines a little bit in the first 6 hours after study, but it's not a very big effect. I think it's interesting. Like other studies should look into this, but it was not in any way sensitive or significant in our experiment. Okay. Okay, and then one of the final things that I want to talk about are, if I've got time, yeah, I've got time. One of the final things I want to talk about was changes in the pattern reproduction. So I mentioned this KL divergence statistic that Blake used, and essentially Blake had shown that the mice were more faithfully reproducing that underlying spatial distribution after 30 days. Our pre-registered hypotheses didn't explicitly look at that KL divergence, but we ran an exploratory analysis to do it, computing the same statistic, KL divergence. And based on the work that Blake did, you would have expected that maybe the spatial distribution, the absolute distribution of locations around the circle that participants were generating would kind of more faithfully reproduce the underlying clustered distribution that participants study with time. Yeah, maybe certainly in the clustered condition, but maybe even in the non-clustered. I mean, if you forget the non-clustered locations, right? Like you've at least got some sort of pattern that you can kind of lump everything into. It might not be semantically related, but it makes sense, sort of thing. But that's not what we see. If I remind, just to remind you, lower levels of KL divergence indicate a closer correspondence between the pattern and the behavior. So you would expect the red bars, the clustered bars, to decrease with time to match the rodent work. But that's not what happens. It's hard to see, but there is an increase with time. And that increase is almost perfectly correlated with the changes in memory accessibility that I showed on in the previous slide. So essentially, all that's happening is forgetting. There's no pattern extraction with time in these data. It's just forgetting of the locations. There is something that happens early on that changes the balance of accessibility and precision, but that's really all that's happening. There's nothing going on in the non-clustered. It's not that the cluster really affects well, I'll talk about that later. But the non-clustered KL divergence stays flat with time, really. Okay, so this is an interim summary, just to sum up what I've talked about so far. Forgetting involves losses in memory accessibility, but not precision. Along the bottom here, what I'm doing is I'm plotting these are non-parametric estimates of those histogram, that histogram that I showed you early on. So this is the angular error plotted over time as these smoothed histograms, if you like. And I will relate all of these take-home messages to these, because I think these are quite nice. They show the effects quite in a different way, not bar charts, but a bit more visually. So forgetting involves losses in memory accessibility and not precision. You can kind of see this by looking at the width of these bell curves. If you were to try and measure the width of these bell curves, like the full width half maximum or something like that, you would see that they don't actually change. The standard deviation of these bell curves doesn't really change very much. Instead, the height of them, or the number of points that belong to them, changes, and the proportion of points that belong to a uniform distribution increases with time. So it's like the width doesn't change very much, but the height, if you like, does. Clustering boosts memory accessibility at the expense of precision. So across the board here, what you would see is that clustering makes precision worse. So the bell curves are wider slightly, and you can kind of see that across the board. So, you know, the red curve kind of encompasses the blue curves at almost each of these retention intervals. It's somehow wider, but that happens at the expense of accessibility. That happens at the expense. Yeah, that happens at the expense of accessibility, such that overall the red curves they peak higher. There's more points. There's more data, more word location associations that belong to those red curves in the first place. You can see the red curves are peak higher in each of these. And clustering doesn't alter the rate of change in accessibility or precision. So these characteristics that we're pulling out in these curves, they are somewhat apparent in the first 6 hours, and they're locked in. They don't change with time. Before I move on, are there any questions about this specifically? Because I'm going to talk about something a little weirder later. Yes.
Are the subjective measures that you have at the end of each course you try?
Yeah.
Are they at all relating to the accessibility or precision? Basically, if your models are predicting what is the correct response, it does congruent with the subjective processes.
Can you repeat the question for the people at home?
Oh yes, of course. So the question is a very good one. The question is whether the subjective memory judgments that I showed you in the design, so what do you remember? Word plus location, word only, or neither? Does that match what the model tells us? Broadly, yes, it does. Yes, if you look at the individual participants. However, I'm skeptical of these data. I don't really, I don't think that these subjective measures really tell us about what people are remembering. And instead, I think that they track confidence. Yeah. So they're just a measure of how confident are you. So if someone's pressing word only, you often find that their location estimates are quite highly accurate when they're saying that they didn't remember the location at all, when they're just pressing word only. So I'm hesitant to say completely yes to your answer, because there is definitely an increase. There's too much precision for word-only trials, if you like. So, and to me that just says that people are using this as like a 2 to 0 scale of confidence. So I kind of discount these subjective measures in that respect. They're interesting if you're interested in confidence, but I didn't really have any hypotheses about them. I didn't really know what to expect. So yeah, it's a good question. I think they're just more confidence. Is there anything else online maybe, or any other questions before I move on? I will move on then. Okay, so that's odd. Very early on in this project, we made an incidental finding that I would like to talk about. And I think this reveals something. It's a bit niche, but I think this reveals something a little interesting about what people are doing when they're doing these tasks. And so here I'm plotting, similar to what you saw on the previous slide, those error histograms, but rather than the error histograms, we've got a change of perspective now. Now these distributions plot the patterns themselves. So they're the location responses at each retention interval, with 0 not being 0 angular error, but being 0 on the cluster. So 0 degrees here is the center of the cluster. And then if you like, this position around the circle is the kind of real world position around that cluster. If that doesn't make sense, I can explain, but it's basically plotting the data in a different way. We're moving away from error and now just looking at the absolute spatial distribution of responses, if you like. So distance from cluster in radians. And if you look here, you can kind of see something a bit weird going on in the non-clustered condition. There's some non-uniformity happening, which is odd. Well, you might think it's odd, right? Because there's no reason why non-clustered responses should not be uniform. If participants are remembering all of the non-clustered responses, all of the non-clustered word location associations, then they were uniformly distributed around the circle, so the resulting spatial distribution should be uniform, right? If they don't remember word location associations in the non-clustered condition, then they should respond randomly, and we assume randomness to be uniform, so there shouldn't be any non-uniformity there either. But instead, you see this kind of avoidance effect that we call it now, such that they're less likely to place non-clustered locations at the center of this cluster. There's a little dip here around 0 degrees, and that's replicated at least in the first kind of 24 hours after the study. It kind of diminishes with time somewhat. So we had some ideas about what this would be. We know it's by its very nature, this must be something to do with the semantics of each of these non-clustered and clustered word categories. It must be attributable to that in some respect, but we wanted to dig into this a little deeper. So Aidan recruited a PhD student to work on this, Jamie Cockcroft, whose photo is over here. And Jamie ran a series of extensions to the work that I did as the registered report, and specifically, it was some of a lot of nice replications as well. So he did 4 experiments in total for this project, where 2 ran online, 2 ran over the web. And in each, the online and over the web, he had a 0 hour and a 24-hour retention interval. So he was testing over time.
What's the difference between online and over the web?
No difference, but Jamie wanted to separate out. I don't know. No difference.
Literally, are they not synonymous with each other?
They are.
What's
They
the
are.
web and what's online?
Oh.
You mean in person?
You're right.
We were all wondering,
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. I didn't see that. Yeah. So in person and over the web. Yeah. So but yeah. it's a good point. It raises a good point. There are actually no differences in significant differences between the in-person data and the web-based data that we collected, but they're shown here split. And yeah, the first thing, so Jamie replicated these conditions of my register report, but he did them with one important difference. Specifically, during the test phase, he showed words that participants hadn't seen during the study phase. So, for instance, during the study phase, they may have seen bed, pillow, mattress, frame, but they didn't see sheets. Yeah, and then at the test phase, participants were cued to locate to find the location of sheets around that circle. So that's the idea of what Jamie was doing. Because he had these kind of novel words in the test phase, we would know that the responses to these couldn't have been derived from any kind of, like, I guess, veridical, like memory trace. There was nothing that people were actually they couldn't. Well, you can argue about that, but they weren't actually basing that on a memory that they had seen or an event that they had seen during the study phase itself. They weren't as strongly related as that. They were things like, as I say, cats, dogs, sheep, natural objects, human-made objects. And across all of these conditions, if you average across all of them, you can see this non-uniformity in the non-cluster condition. There's this dip around the center of the cluster, an under-density, if you like. So that comes out quite clearly. And over here, what I'm showing you is the mean density at this cluster. So it's just basically the difference between this uniform point and this uniform line and the peak density, or the density at the clustered center. And that's certainly quite strongly non-uniform after 0 hours delay, and then it's still non-uniform after 24 hours, but it kind of returns to some uniformity with time. Okay, so what's going on here? Yes. Okay, in that case, this will be my final slide. I've got nothing else to say. And what I think is going on here is a base rate neglect. So I think that this shows that participants aren't really attending to, they kind of like don't focus on the fact that some locations around the circle are associated with more words. It sounds kind of weird, but I think that's what's happening. Instead, participants really take home a representation that encodes, they really encode a representation that tells them what is the average semantic what's the average semantic meaning of each word at each point around the circle. So they encode a spatial semantic representation that tells them how what is the average word, if you like, at the 2 o'clock position. And the average word at the 2 o'clock position, if you talk about averages, it's very red category like in this example, yeah, and it's very blue category like at, say, the 7 o'clock position, because there's more blue category words over here. So that kind of that average, by its very nature, it ignores the number of word location associations that went into computing the average. And if you ignore the number of word location associations that went into the computing that average representation, then you'll produce these base rate neglects. Because when it comes to the test, you go, okay, right, so I've got sheets. Where do I put sheets? Well, I'm going to search through this circular space. I'm going to find the point where sheets matches my my average semantic representation for each point around the circle, and it best matches it over here, because by the very nature that it's far away from the clustered center, from where it doesn't match, and that produces this non-uniformity. We have a theoretical. This was the description of the model that we won't go into, but I have a theoretical. I have a model, a computational model that recreates this very nicely, and it's surprisingly simple what goes into the model, but it can reproduce the behavioral data that participants give us very easily. With like one free parameter, and that's basically it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. We've got time for a question or two.
Cool.
Study that you just presented. I couldn't see whether you were separating out the responses that were down to these ones where there wasn't any true position and it was just guessing, or indeed it was presented, but was it driven by the errors that people were making if they couldn't remember the location? They just thought, okay, well, I'm going to shift it away from the clustered location.
Yeah. So the data that I presented. Oh yes, sure. The question was to clarify whether these data that I show here, whether they relate to trials that had no true location that was shown at study, or whether they include words that were shown at study as well. And the truth is, for these data, it was all the words that were not shown at study. It only included words that were not shown at study. So these data are what we call, I don't like the name so much, but generalization trials, trials for which they weren't presented at the study phase. However, as I mentioned, this raises a good point. Even in my data, where I had none of these generalization trials, you still see the same non-uniformity. And that's, I think, because of the same reason. Like, as you say, if you forget the location of a word, then it's a novel generalization trial. So you would expect some proportion of the words to produce this effect. Maybe not as strongly as in these data, but yeah.
Alexa has a question.
Yeah, can I ask something? Yeah, great talk, Sam, thanks. I just wondering, so it sounds like, unless I missed something, you were kind of expecting that the clustered items would be sort of consolidated better.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you'd get a different result if they were sort of linked to some a priori meaningful cluster rather than just a kind of a completely novel accidental bit of clustering.
Maybe that's a very good point. Like if it relates to pre-existing knowledge, yes. I think I have never considered that. I think I'm looking up into the sky, expecting you to be. Okay, hello.
Oh yeah, I'm God now. Yeah. It just sort of struck me. I felt like your idea had come from something that has to do with this sort of great consolidation and in light of regularities. A lot of that is really in the real world. That's to do with prior knowledge, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I think that's very possible. I think, though, for me, one of the biggest differences between the rodent studies that Blake did and our study is that simply, we're not asking humans to swim for their lives in a horrible environment that they're uncomfortable in. And I just think it was kind of a bit naive of us, or a bit arrogant in a way, to think that our stimuli are so important that our participants are gonna go home, they're gonna sleep, and they're gonna think about these words, and they're gonna consolidate these memories in their sleep. I think that our brains are much smarter than that, and that they will, actually, in hindsight, it's not important. It's not really important to people to know this sort of stuff, even if they're gonna get paid £10-12 for it. So I think that's one of the reasons why we didn't see the same differences. But yeah, I agree. If it was linked to some sort of prior knowledge, then maybe that's something that we would see an effect of. Yeah.
But it could be because of emotion, stress, etc., or it could be because they're somehow I don't know, the water maze has got any semantic trappings. I'm thinking of the other Richard Morris paradigm too much, probably.
Yeah, something to consider, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. We have to leave because we're going to be kicked out of the room. But
cool.
Thank you for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
You mentioned that this was the BPS prize winning.
Yeah.
Tell the audience.
Yes, this was a BPS prize winning paper. I won an award for this. I don't know quite how, but.
And it's published in Nature Human Behaviour, right?
It is.
The first ever registered report.
The first ever successful. It wasn't that I think we published the first not significant result because all of the rest were like not failed of effect.
Okay. Thank you everyone at home.